Okay, so in this video, I wanted to discuss about a report I'm reading currently from the International Energy Agency on the role of oil and gas industry in net zero emissions. Now, I say in this video, but I think this is going to be a whole video series and probably a longer one because it's the actual report is somewhere around 250 to 300 pages. So I will link that in the description if you want to go ahead and give it a read. But it's basically a book, and I mean the way I usually use this channel. I mean I only have one video on the channel, but the way I plan to use the channel is basically to just dump anything and everything that I learn. So yeah, anyways, in this video series, I want to just summarize whatever I understood from the report. And coming to the topic, I think going into the topic, the way we think about energy transition is that when we say clean energy or net zero emissions, we often think that that means elimination of the use of oil and gas. But as we will see in this video series, the goal is not elimination but minimization of the use of fossil fuels, oil and gas, whatever that category entails. Because it's one thing to replace the use of fossil fuels in industries where there are alternatives available, such as transport. We see, the rise in electric vehicles penetration around the world has helped us a lot in reducing some of that oil demand year on year. But in more, in industries where the use of oil is more necessary, let's say petrochemicals or buildings construction or commercial transport, where the use of EV or the innovation in EV is not as great as in the personal vehicle segment. These are the industries that we are really talking about when we think about minimization of oil use and elimination of oil use. We know the industries where the use of fossil fuels can be eliminated, but a more critical point is basically managing the industries where complete elimination may not be directly possible, or at least based on the current level of innovation, it doesn't seem possible in the near future. So yeah, anyways, in this video specifically, we are going to understand the current state of the oil and gas industry. So this video is not going to directly jump into how oil and gas, relates to clean energy transition, but I think this is I think the first few pages of the report basically just sets the stage for the things that we want to discuss in the report. It just helps you understand the current state of the business, how oil and gas as an industry operates, who are the major players, how are they categorized, stuff like that. So I think we should just start off with it. Uh, so yeah, I think the report starts off by introducing us to four categories of players that operate in the oil and gas industry as a whole. So the first one is the majors. So let me change it to pencil. Yeah, the first one are the majors. So these are the players that are usually listed on the stock exchanges in Europe or USA. So you can think of players like uh, Chevron. They are, the largest players in the whole world in this industry. Now, they can have some downstream operations, but most of their value is generated from their upstream operations. So they are mostly focused on upstream operations. So if you don't know, there are two ways oil companies are usually categorized. An upstream oil company basically extracts oil from oil reserves in the ocean, whereas a downstream company is the consumer of that raw crude oil. So for an upstream company, the downstream refinery, say Reliance, or you can think of, I mean, I know that Chevron also have some downstream exposure. So I mean, I'm lacking a few examples as to the downstream players, but think Reliance in India. For a company like, ONGC, or let's say Saudi Aramco, which extracts oil directly from the ocean, a refinery like Reliance, which is a downstream player, would be a consumer. So these are the two ways that we usually split oil players. And according to the report, the majors are usually the ones who have a higher upstream exposure compared to downstream exposure. Then comes independents. Now these players are similar to up majors, but they you can think of them like one level below majors, where they may not be as big as majors, but they are still big. They can operate a fully integrated oil supply chain where they also have upstream operations, but they also have downstream operations. So if you read between the lines, these players could be that don't have as much upstream operations but have more downstream operations. So they can be a bit downstream heavy compared to majors. The third one they talk about are NOCs, or national oil companies. Now, these are the companies that are usually managed or owned by a home government. So you can think of Saudi Aramco or Qatar Energy. I think most of the oil companies, energy companies in the Gulf are NOCs in that sense, where the government has a majority stake or a huge stake in their operations, and the profit and the income that they make off of their operations. So yeah, the main characteristic is that they are owned or controlled by their home government. They also have a government mandate to explore and exploit any natural resources that their home country has. Now they are mostly engaged in upstream development, and they have a minute role in downstream operations, if any. The fourth one, I think, is sort of related to this third one, and this is called international NOCs. So the way I understood it is that these are, let's say, companies which are still owned by the home government, but they collaborate with other NOCs to explore and exploit natural resources are in and around the world. One characteristic of these INOCs is that it could be that because they don't have an abundance of natural resources of crude themselves, they need to go out and collaborate with other NOCs so that they can be a part of those upstream operations. So you can think of Oil and Natural Gas Corporation in India. It is owned by the government, and it because India doesn't have a lot of crude reserve in you know owned by India, they need to go out and collaborate with other NOCs and other major companies so that they can be a part of that upstream operation. Now, apart from these four players, there are a few intermediaries in between, like shipping companies, refineries that take this crude oil and then supply it to the end user, the consumer market. Now, coming to its, we have understood what these players are, but what do they own? What are their reserves? What are their investments? So I think this section basically talks about, as the name suggests, their reserves in and around the world, but also the investments, the capex that they are making towards clean energy. I think this is sort of the first introduction, the first connection that the report makes between oil and gas industry and the clean energy industry, the clean energy transition. So, in terms of reserves, the report states that uh, the majors own somewhere around 13% of global oil reserves, whereas NOCs and INOCs own around 60% or so. Now, this statistic by in itself is not so interesting. I mean, I think it's logical that because there's a huge government stake in this industry, obviously the government is going to take the most, the most share of whatever that commodity is. But I think the interesting part is that INOCs and NOCs, they spend only about 45% of total capex in the oil and gas industry compared to, let's say, other players. So in terms of capex, their capex is not, major, but the reserves that they own are, they own the majority of the reserves around the world. So the reason for that is that the assets that are owned by these NOCs and INOCs are of the highest quality compared to, let's say, something that is owned by a major company. The Let's say an oil reserve that an NOC or INOC is managing, the quality of that oil reserve will be higher, and it will degrade slowly compared to an oil reserve that is managed by a major. The reason for that could be that, a government owned entity can have the first right towards any oil reserves that they find in their home country, so they can get the highest quality of things firsthand rather than passing it on to other private players also. So that is an interesting thing. uh, Now in terms of investment, the report discusses that the highest, investment for both natural gas and oil are, sort of committed by the majors. But yeah, they do hold the lowest. I think, yeah, this is just summing up what we have discussed here. Just checking my notes. Yeah, so this is basically just summing up what we discussed here, that majors commit the highest in capex, but they don't always get the highest in reserves, is what I understood from the report. Now, one thing that the report also discusses about is partnerships. It states that partnerships are pretty common in this industry. And the reason for that is basically that it allows players to expose themselves to oil reserves that are not owned by them. First of all, I think I need to clear this. When we talk about oil reserves, here we are talking about 2P reserves. So these are proved plus probable reserves that we know are there, and the reserves that are probably there. So this is the way they usually talk about reserves in this industry. When they say that, let's say, Saudi Aramco has this many reserves, it's usually 2P reserves. But anyways, partnerships in this industry is pretty prevalent, and the reason for that is that you get exposure to an oil reserve which is not owned by you, and that gives you an added advantage of basically increasing your capacity without actually owning any of that capacity. So if, Reliance, not no Reliance, let's say ONGC only owns, just this is just for the sake of, you know sake of an example, only owns 20 million barrel of oil equivalent per day. Now this is its, owned capacity, but it wants to increase that processing capacity to, let's say, 30 million. It can partner with Saudi Aramco and increase its daily processing capacity to 30 million barrel per day. So this partnership gives both of the players an added advantage, where ONGC gets a share of the reward but also shares the risk of Saudi Aramco. And that risk part is the most beneficial for Saudi Aramco, where now, because they were managing that oil reserve on their own, they were the sole owner of any of that loss that oil reserve may incur for them, if, let's say, if the oil reserve gets degraded quite quickly than they had hoped. So they are able to then share that risk with ONGC. So partnerships like these are pretty prevalent in this industry, where they share the reward but they also share the risk. In terms of revenue and spending, the 50% of oil, 50% of revenue that an oil company generates is usually given back to the government in terms of taxes. The rest 40% is their capex or opex. So what we are saying here is, let's say if a company earns 100 million, or let's say 1 billion, yeah, that's more realistic, they would give 50% of that, on average 500 million, to the government. The rest 40% will be their opex and capex, and the rest 10% is given back to the shareholders as you know dividends or share buybacks, return to shareholders. Now I think we can finally move on to the, I think, the part that now connects this to the energy transition. uh, so this report, I think, mainly discusses as to the discusses about the current state of capex spending by these oil and gas players in clean energy transition. So it states that one key thing that these companies have tried to offer and are still offering to us, I mean, not to us in the in the sense that to us as a whole world, to other countries and in international forums, and the way their business is placed is they want to move their focus away from crude towards natural gas, because in natural gas they still have a lot of exposure, and it's not a lot of capex that they would need to do to increase their concentration of natural gas, and reduce the exposure in oil, because natural gas is still considered to be a more durable fuel in our goal towards clean energy transition. So that is one key thing that these companies offer, but that is not enough, because natural gas is still harmful for the environment. It's a better solution, but it's not the solution. There are better alternatives available. So in terms of pure clean energy spend, you'll see that companies with the highest proportion of spends on clean energy spend around 15 to 25% of their capex budget, and they do this by acquisitions or investing in more clean technology such as carbon capture or offshore wind energy, stuff like that. But as a whole, the oil and gas industry spent around $20 billion in 2022 on these clean energy initiatives and technologies, which is just about 3% of the total capex budget for that year, and just 1% of the total clean energy investment for that year. So they are nowhere near the level where they help in moving that needle towards that clean energy transition. I think that is all I wanted to document in this part of the series, because that's all I have really understood as of now. One final thing for the, I think, yeah, one more thing I should maybe add to this video is that, and I think this will set the stage for the next part of the series, is the scenarios that they discuss, that from here, where do we go? So they basically put three scenarios in front of us, the report. And these scenarios are basically future trajectories based on where we are and how much implementation we can do towards our clean energy goals. So the first scenario that the report states is a steps scenario, which is stated policies scenario. So this scenario mainly considers only the things that the governments and the companies around the world are actually doing, rather than considering what they said they would do. So this only considers actual plans in motion, actual initiatives currently being worked upon, And to be honest, this seems like the most realistic scenario you would take seriously because it is factual and not based on optimistic assumptions and belief, in governments uh, achieving their promises. So this scenario basically states that annual fossil fuel demand should peak by 2030 and the global temperature should reach around 2.4 degrees Celsius by 2100. The second scenario is announced pledges scenario, or APS. And I think this scenario is basically the step scenario plus the commitments that these governments and companies have made. So everything that they are doing in steps. Plus, we would also like to consider in this scenario commitments that are being made by these governments and companies. And we are assuming that if they are successful in, fulfilling those commitments, then CO2 emissions should be 70% lower in 2050 versus in 2022, and global temperature should peak around 1.7 degrees Celsius by around 2100. Finally, the last scenario the report talks about is the most idealistic one. Let's change to green for this. Net zero emissions. This is where we want to reach ideally, but if I compare this with the step scenario, because steps is currently what we are doing, we are nowhere near this. So net zero emissions basically states that we do everything we need to do to reach net zero emissions by 2050, and we should be able to limit global temperature to 1.4 degrees Celsius by 2100. Now this is the most idealistic scenario, and I think in the I think in future parts of this series we will basically build upon these scenarios and try to understand, based on where the demand of oil is, based on where the supply of oil is, the steps we can take to achieve targets in each of these scenarios. I think the best part about the report is that it also discusses the engineering behind this industry. It also discusses the challenges that the industry may face. So it's not just about having a will to transition from oil to, let's say, a more cleaner fuel. It's also about the challenges faced by physics of the industry as to why we cannot do that. For example, even though we want to transition towards cleaner energy, we know that according to the report, the demand for virgin plastics is only going to rise, which is only going to rise in the future, and that is a petrochemical in itself. And petrochemicals main raw product is crude and different types of crude derivatives that it uses to create uh, other commodities. So I think in the future part of this series we are definitely going to discuss a lot more about that. But I think that is all for this video. uh, yeah, I think see you in the next one.